really love to hear from you, but I'm like, I need to stick to time. But thank you so much for an amazing contribution. Just Russell as well as Zuki, there's 2 questions. So if you're able to just hash it out as well as on the comment, please just do that. That will be great. I'm really excited to bring into the discussion our next panelist. She is Yana van Leeuw. She is the director of ENS Africa's public law practice. She focuses on the dissection between corporate and commercial law on the one hand and public law on the other hand. She is a long-standing member of the Equal Education and a current member of Equity Collective. She is particularly interested in the tension between human rights and neoliberalism. I'm really excited to hear from Yana. You can take the floor. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks very much, Russell and Pamela, for the invitation. I have a presentation. It'd be great if you can put it on. And my presentation is really just going to focus on the nuts and bolts of procurement. And I think that piggybacks very well off what Zuki and Russell have been contributing. So while the presentation comes online, let me just say that my brief was to give an overview of procurement in South Africa and the need for reform, but really to do this properly, even at a high level, is really a summation of 25 years of procurement. So I'm going to be much more modest and just give you the broad outlines of what the legal framework applicable to public procurement looks like. And then we'll explore how the Public Procurement Bill resolves some of these issues, how it creates new problems, and how it just doesn't resolve any issues at all. So, and because the bill is supposed to be very comprehensive, I'm only really going to touch on 3 examples. So I'm already onto my second slide. As soon as it comes up. Thanks. Not this one. This is about TB Accountability Consortium. Okay, so the second slide is a quotation of Section 217 of the Constitution, and Zuki was saying, we got to take it back. This is a constitutional project, and the constitutional provision of 217 it really actually just does 3 things. The first is that it mandates a specific type of contracting system for certain types of contracts for goods and services. There we go. Thank you so much. And that system must be fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, and cost effective. So that's the one thing it does. The second thing it does is it identifies procurement as an empowerment tool. And the third thing is that it requires national legislation. So these are very high level objectives. It's a high level system. And so really to discover the flesh of the procurement system, you have to look at the national legislation. And in the next slide, I've got a list of the key national legislation that's applicable to procurement, depending on what the entity is and where the entity resides within the state. So you would have heard of the PFMA, and within the PFMA, there are treasury regulations and there are also treasury instructions. Both have the effect of law. Then you've got the MFMA and the regulations to the MFMA. There's the Preferential Procurement Framework Act, plus the policies associated with preferential procurement. And then what we have are specific entity-specific supply chain management policies that will apply. So, you know, to say what is the procurement policy of the National Department of Health, you say, well, what is the supply chain management policy? And then within their supply chain management policy, they will also have other policies like their delegations of authority or their significance and materiality framework. So that's just, in a very high level, a list of all of the national legislation that would apply for procurement. And in the next slide, because, because we're dealing with procurement, that is administrative action. That's a type of action that the state or the bureaucracy does when it's taking decisions that affect rights or might affect rights. In the next slide, I've just got a list of those additional pieces of legislation, and that's the PAJA, the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, which requires that when the state or organs of state are making decisions that impact rights, they have to do so in accordance with the lawful, reasonable, and procedurally fair processes. The Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Practices makes a range of activities, corrupt activities and offense, and some of those relate to procurement. And then, of course, because fundamental to the procurement system is an empowerment tool, the BEE Act is also applicable. So when you're thinking about today, as it stands now, what is the law of procurement? It's really quite a big long list, laundry list of national legislation, regulations, treasury instructions, and then entity-specific policies. Thanks. To the next slide. And so when you're looking at trying to assess whether expenditure is irregular, and this is often a question you get from financial institutions who finance bidders who are successful and they want to deliver on the contract and then need financing from banks. Banks will often come and say, is this procurement valid? Is there anything irregular? This slide really just gives you a snapshot of the details that one has to go through to assess which act applies, what entity are we dealing with, what is the preference regime. If it's a state-owned company, like in the health sector, say it's the National Health Laboratory Service, what type of entity is it in the PFMA, and therefore which aspects of the Treasury regulations apply, what do the bid documents say, and then what is included in the bid documents would be all of those things listed there in the brackets, the advertisement, tax certificates, the actual tender documents itself. Then you need to look at the specific supply chain management policy, letters of award, and so you can see that your head can get one's head gets dizzy with this long list of requirements, and sometimes it's not clear which apply when, or what specific type of supply chain management policy is applicable at a particular entity. So the Public Procurement Bill in the next slide really tries to solve this fragmentation and opaqueness and a lack of standardization by attempting to bring a one-size-fits-all, in the sense that the Minister of Finance is required to make regulations to prescribe a procurement system for government, which is an incredible and ambitious objective, because what it does is take a very devolved system. Government entities can write their supply chain management policy, and those supply chain policies will be consistent with the legislation. They organize their procuring institutions, they organize their institutions around this devolved capacity to procure and to in accordance with their budgets. And it's going to take that system and create a standardized system for everyone. So it's going to change from a devolved system to quite a centralized system. Now, the Minister of Finance can differentiate in the procurement bill between institutions and categories of procurement, but nothing requires the Minister of Finance to do this. It's just a discretionary power that he or she will have. And there's no guidance in the bill about when the minister may exercise this discretion to differentiate and what factors are relevant. So on the one hand, the procurement bill tries to solve this problem of fragmentation by saying the Minister of Finance can just make regulation, a supply chain management system for everyone. But there are significant problems with this approach. The first is what I've already explained to you, which is that the procurement system public entities, government entities, state-owned companies have already developed their procurement systems in a way that allows for them to have a devolved system. Their institutions are organized around this. So they'll need to change their organizations, their procurement units, the kinds of committees that they have, and so on. And then the second is really about the lack of guidance and prompting by the legislature to the minister about when differentiation between institutions and types of procurement is necessary or required. And you know, you can already think try to imagine what a procurement system, or why one would have different procurement systems for municipalities or versus national departments of health, or for SANRAL versus other ESCOM, for example. So you can already start to ask yourself, to what degree would such a one-size-fits-all approach really work, or rather you'd say standardization to what end? So some guiding principles or considerations for differentiation between categories of public institutions and types of procurement could be things like what the size of the entity is, what the types of commodities or services that are being provided or procured, the extent to which there's a need for standardization, whether there's a need to comply with financial guarantees, the extent to which there's a need to remain competitive or innovative in the context of a particular market, whether there's a need to compete for special commodities might be a factor to differentiate, whether there's a need to provide a basic level of services to a particular sector. Then there are no pointers in the legislation to the minister. And I think that this is a problem, because it will be important for the minister to differentiate between categories of institutions or categories of procurement. And you don't really have to look too far to the context of the NHI about why that is important, because really the NHI is creating a special procurement system for health. And it makes provision for units and entities and committees that will be responsible for identifying health services and health products, buying these. And it's not clear how these two pieces of legislation are going to interact. So it's possible under the bill. The bill allows the Minister of Finance to make exemptions from the application of the Procurement Act, and that could be a way of dealing with the issue, or not dealing with the issue by simply exempting. But it is going to be important, certainly in the way in which the NHI and the procurement bill become operationalized, for there to be comity between the bill, because I think Russell mentioned that the NHI fund will be a Section 3A public entity, and the procurement bill will apply to that entity. And so one's got to read the way in which the processes that the fund follows with the procurement bill. And there are some kind of practical problems that could arise. For instance, the Public Procurement Office at this point must create and maintain a database for prospective suppliers. Now, this already exists to some degree in the Central Supply Database, and you know, the efficacy and the utility of that database is subject to debate, because the National Treasury might just consider things like the tax certificate of the entity and their MOI, and they say, okay, this is a legitimate entity. But if you are procuring health products, or more generally, if you are building houses, other things, you need other things to accredit a potential supply, which the National Treasury doesn't look at when it builds its database. And so the procurement bill also says that procuring entities must procure from the database. So there's immediately, you can see there's tensions between what the NHI envisages for creating its supplier and product list, services and product list, versus what the public procurement office is going to develop in terms of the national supplier database. So there's a lot of working out that still needs to happen in the interplay between these two pieces of legislation. I'm just going to mention two more things of the procurement bill. The next one is not fixing a problem, on the next slide, which is really the concern that this issue of multiple regulatory instruments that we have. And you will recall that I kind of listed some of those. And in the bill, the minister can make regulations, national and provincial treasury can make instructions and guidelines, and then the public procurement office is also going to make guidelines and instructions. And that's not necessarily going to solve the problem of having multiple regulatory instruments that are applicable to procurement. So it doesn't seem to me that there's been a resolution to this issue of fragmentation. But there's a much more critical problem, I think, with this multiple regulatory instruments, which I just want to flag here. And this is the difference between instructions and regulations. Now, instructions and regulations, they have the same effect. They're binding. If there's non-compliance with an instruction, the expenditure can be irregular. But they have very different ways of public engagement. The most obvious thing is that instructions are not gazetted. They're not put out for public comment. The Treasury just issues them. Whereas regulations, there is a notice and comment process. And so the question is, in reading the bill, is why instructions for one and regulations for other, and when are instructions appropriate? You can understand that sometimes National Treasury or Provincial Treasury needs to respond quickly, but perhaps that needs to be in more exceptional circumstances. And in the last slide, I'll show why I think that's important, which is kind of ending off on a positive note on the bill. And that's really in what we can see are improved opportunities for transparency and oversight. And I'm only gonna touch on two, because Zuki mentioned one already, which is that the Public Procurement Office must determine measures for the public to access procurement processes, scrutinize procurement, and monitor high value or complex procurement. And this is really important, and an important innovation, because it means that the public will be able to observe bid deliberations. They'll be able to be in the room when bids are opened, be in the room when technical criteria are discussed. But they can do that obviously to the extent that it doesn't limit candid deliberations, or there's no risk to officials from undue influence or threats. But there is at least a basis for an innovation to have the public in the room, which is going to be critical for the integrity, ongoing integrity and credibility of our procurement system. And then the second feature is in around proactive disclosure of bid information. Supposed to be, the words are as quickly as possible. Zuki, I hope this means in real time. On a platform, you know, all the information relating to the bid, the identity and end of the bidders, the contracts should be available with the supplier, and there's proactive disclosure there. So again, a really important potential innovation, but they're gonna do it by instruction, and I think that it's possibly more better done through regulation, so that there's an engagement with civil society, the media, the public, on what the format of this important innovation is going to be, so that it can promote the objects of the bill, which is to improve transparency and public oversight. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jana. Thank you so much for an amazing contribution. We are behind time. I do apologize for that. We're gonna just keep you for a bit long, but it is worth it, I must say. It is very hard for me to stop the conversation because everything that everybody is saying is so worth being said. So I don't want to compromise the quality of the discussion because of time. We do respect your time, but we also just bear with us. I'm also just very excited about introducing our last panel member, and his name is Dominic Brown. He is a passionate activist, proficient researcher, and an accomplished strategist. He is currently the director of the Alternative Information and Development Center, the AIDC. Throughout his career, Dominic has contributed significantly to debates and discussions, particularly regarding the economic developments and the unfolding energy transitions. His impactful research and publications, along with numerous opinion pieces, have shed light on critical topics like corporate corruption, illicit financial flows, and a just energy transition. Dominic's advocacy and expertise have made him a prominent voice in promoting economic justice and driving positive change in South Africa. So I'm very excited about giving the floor to Dominic Brown. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela. That's very kind. And well done to the Rural Health Advocacy Project on what I think is an important report. The issue, I think, of procurement is extremely important and I think often neglected. Just by way of an example, the level of public procurement in the country is approximately 25% of GDP, and the majority of the government's involvement within the economy is actually through procurement. So it's not a small issue, it's of extreme significance and often doesn't get the attention required within the public discourse. Now, more generally, the level of losses as a result of bad procurement practices is major, whereby in 2016, the former Chief Procurement Officer, Kenneth Brown, estimated that between 30 to 40% of South Africa's procurement budget is lost to inflated prices and fraud by the private sector. And at the time, this was approximately 230 billion rand. At the moment, our procurement budget is around about 1 trillion rand, which means that we're losing between 300 and 400 billion rand each year as a result of corruption linked to public procurement. And this is, of course, has many detrimental impacts, not least in terms of service delivery. I think it's important to recognize the role that BEE and the linkages between BEE and public procurement and how this enables a situation of corruption. And it's linked or rooted in the post-apartheid government reforming the procurement framework to try and overcome the problem where the majority of the people, the businesses the state contracted were originally white businesses only. And so there was a process towards decentralizing procurement practices post-apartheid to try and engender greater procurement related to Black businesses. And BEE was a key vehicle for this. And I think it highlights how the development of BEE, the decentralization of procurement, while benefiting a minority of Black elites, has come at the expense of the majority of people in the population. So in a context where you're having more than 5% in real terms being cut from public health care, there's lots of arguments that we can, in fact, avoid reducing the spending to essential services, including health, by streamlining procurement and ensuring greater regulation and oversight over procurement practices. Of course, this is going to come to a head politically with those within the state and others who are dependent on the state for accumulation. And just by way of an example, in 2016, approximately 9,000 civil servants were stopped from having procurements with businesses related to those civil servants. So it's extremely pervasive and entrenched within the South African state. And so they will require a number of changes, not only to the procurement framework, but also holding those accountable who have taken advantage of these loopholes within the procurement practices. And it's not only within the government in and of itself, as Jana indicates, it's also quite prevalent within SOEs. And there we have seen some resources being returned back to SOEs when these procurement irregularities have been detected. I think that's something we need to continue pursuing going forward. So I think this is an important issue. I think it must be rooted within a global context where most states have outsourced key functions to the private sector, which creates an enabling environment for procurement irregularities. This is exacerbated within the South African context in order to create a Black capitalist class, and the level of resources that we are losing as a result of it is substantial, between 300 and 400 billion rand each year. And this has, as we have indicated, a number of problematic impacts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thank you for keeping it short and very informative. And thank you for the participants for still being here. I'm just going to open the floor for any questions, any comments. You can just raise your hand if there's any. Sharon, I note you, and you can take the floor.
Thanks very much. First of all, I was actually writing it in the chat, but I wanted to congratulate you on an outstanding panel. It sort of gives me huge hope for the future in South Africa, because we've been exposed to both individuals and organizations that are absolutely essential for trying to achieve what I believe South Africa could be. And I hope at least the journalists who are here also profile the organizations, as well as of course yourselves and the reports, because these are absolutely essential non-governmental organizations and people working in various sectors who can help us deliver a South Africa that actually is able to deliver on the service needs. I had, besides all that, I actually had a question. I was listening to Jana talking about the complexity of procurement processes, and the question of how complex it really is. I mean, I do get that there are a lot of the points that she made, but is it unreasonable to imagine that an accounting officer, whether they're working at municipal level, at provincial level, at national level, is it an unreasonable expectation that we should imagine that such people can in fact navigate their way through these complexities, that they do understand how they work? Or is it that the rules and regulations, the infrastructure and so on are so complicated that actually, even if you wanted to do the right thing and you wanted to do well, you really just, you couldn't. So where I mean, clearly both things can be true, but say, for example, we had someone who was really competent. Are they sitting in a spaghetti of information, rules and regulations that is impossible to unravel? Or could we expect them to do that? So I suppose what I'm asking is where is the problem? How do we find those solutions? And I myself, I have no idea what the answer to that is. So I'm really keen to hear what people on your panel think about that. Thanks very much for the opportunity to ask the question.
Thank you, Sharon, for the question. I think I'm gonna let all our panel members to just few seconds just to answer that question in terms of what they think the answer is. Jana, we can just start with you.
Sure. Look, Sharon, the good news is there's a lot of procurement, as has been said, and there's a lot of very, procurement's also happening in the ordinary course properly. So there are very good, competent officials in the state who understand what their processes are and who are, who do this on a daily basis. The issue about irregularity can be any non-compliance can meet with irregularity. So non-compliance with the requirement doesn't always mean that there's malfeasance or there's corruption. Sometimes it's just a technical slip, but because we view irregular expenditure, and that's why I think under the new Public Audit Act that you have this question of material irregularity adding in. So there are lots of competent people who run procurements all the time, every day, on a daily basis, and they do it fine. The issue about simplifying and standardizing is that, particularly at the supply chain management level, is that as you sit here today, you don't know what the supply chain management policy is of SANRAL. It's not published information. You don't have the SCM policy for the Department of Health or the National Health Laboratory Services. And if compliance with these things is a two-way street, it's, irregularity occurs both because the government entity didn't do what it was supposed to do, or there was some problem with what the bidder did, then it is useful to have something that's standardized, that's publicly available, that's everybody knows what the rules are internal to that specific entity, because I think it promotes and supports compliance rather than you find out, you conclude a tender or there's a process and you find out that there was some approval or document or signature or certificate that that wasn't there, that
Is it just me, or have we lost Jana's?
say about the general the value of it being known generally. Sorry, see, I can talk too much, so thank you for
the response. Is there any other panelists who would like to add?
Yeah, look, I probably would like to add, and Look, I think at the end of the day, one of the things that we've learned in South Africa is that great policies don't always lead to great implementation, right? And I think 30 years into our democracy, I think we have a couple of questions that we need to ask. Firstly, around the general state and whether one of the priority things we should actually be talking about is electoral reform, right? So that we can firstly improve our politics, because we've had the same party in government for the last 30 years. And that has probably led to a conflation of government and state into one sort of superfluous entity, when in fact it only works when we have an independent civil service, and that the government is responsible for political accountability of that independent civil service. Over the last 30 years, because we've had this conflation, political influence and into procurement processes have become a much bigger problem than what it should be, right? So I think for me, the first step is looking at electoral reform and how can we address some of these gaps in that separation between political and administrative authority. In the second instance, again, you know, even if we have all these regulatory frameworks, a lot of the day-to-day work happens behind the scenes, right? And I think this is why some of the things that all of us asked for in our submissions on the NHI bill was to ensure that there's civil society participation at all levels of the health system. And I'm talking about healthcare in particular. And then we also need our funding partners to invest in strengthening our ability to participate in all these structures in the first instance. And in the second instance, to provide meaningful training to people affected by the services and their representatives to actively participate in governance. Because we can have, I mean, one of the things we saw with procurement, just setting up sticking to the confines of a bid committee and bid evaluation rules and X, Y, and Z will not take away the risk linked to corruption. What will is transparency. But I think for me, the main thing that I'd like to see in the next elections is conversations around electoral reform. Secondly, conversations around giving life and funding to participatory democracy. And then to add to what Suki says, more transparency on public procurement information and the like. Thank you. Over. Suki?
Yeah, Pamela, can I jump in?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thanks. Yeah, absolutely agree with both inputs. And perhaps just the one thing, and not to be necessarily negative, but I think one of the complexities or the current institutional arrangements around intergovernmental cooperation being lacking does mean that even in the best case scenarios where we do have the sort of best staffing arrangements and expertise, you know, at this rate, poor coordination, for instance, between you know, the NPA, SARS, and National Treasury and the SIU, for instance, does often mean that you know, what cracks do exist are deepened with the intergovernmental relations. And I think that's another area that has been emphasized by different people in different ways. On the aspect of perhaps the departmental staffing question and the professionalization of appointments, one thing that I think is also worth considering is that you know, over the years, the Public Service Accountability Monitor, you know, in addition to our specific work on health, which we no longer focus on specifically, but vacancies of skilled officials and skilled officials who you know who have integrity have had a significant impact, and not just in the context of procurement as we're talking about today, but more broadly. But then when we start to talk about such a specialized field as supply chain management and so on, that is bound to be something significant. So I think to the question, one of the things that would be really worth all of us advocating more strongly around is for, you know, this, whether it's the regulator, whatever we want to call it, for departments and entities to be required to report really quite regularly when meaningful posts or when impactful posts on procurement and financial management become vacant, and when they are, you know, occupied by acting staff year on year on year, which we see in the public service quite often. And then the other aspect is really that there is a need to directly address this issue of, for instance, chief financial officers and director general positions, which are actually quite difficult positions, and politically they are hot seats. And so we are, one of the things that you begin to see is that officials who are well capacitated, who have the expertise, may not want to take those positions, may not want to fill those positions, which I think is something that, particularly when we start to talk about procurement again, we are seeing more of. So if we want to support a culture of ethical professionalism, these are some of the issues that we really need to kind of directly engage with and directly tackle. And in addition to what Russell has specifically shared around political arrangements and what the elections will potentially mean. Yeah, but there's really so much around the public service. And maybe one last point is really that linked to this, even though it may not seem directly relevant, is that it would be quite meaningful for all the points that are being raised and the discussions around the NHI and the provisions around procurement and contracting. If we want to really see a meaningful professionalization of the public service, perhaps those other policy arrangements and policy reform discussions that are happening, we should be influencing those as well, and collectively kind of around those issues, creating stronger solidarity. So those would be just some inputs. I think Sharon's questions, yeah, very provocative and quite solid. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zuki. I'm just gonna give the last words to Dominic as well as Russell, answering Sharon's and adding Nelly's answer to the two questions. Dominic, you can go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to thank all the contributors, first of all, for, I thought, very useful contributions, from which I also draw lots of lessons. Two, I want to say that this is not going to be a silver bullet to reform public procurement. And I think that there's added complexity when you hear, for example, of ANC tender committees who has a tender chairperson who then is able to determine who gets and who doesn't get various contracts. And so this is deeply rooted within the state, from local government level all the way up to national level and across SOEs. And now the easy response may be to try and further minimize the size of the state and thereby reduce the potential for corruption through procurement practices. This may have negative unintended consequences in relation to service delivery. And so I think that we have to have a much more nuanced response as opposed to a knee-jerk one in trying to deal with the question of public sector procurement. I think at the heart of it is this interplay or dynamic between public-private sector corruption, and two, the role that the creation of a Black bourgeoisie plays within the context of the South African state. So I think ultimately, therefore, that it does require broader rethinking about the overarching macroeconomic and fiscal framework that we are operating in, so as to ensure that there's more public-public partnerships as a means to mitigate and ameliorate against increased levels of corruption and patronage. Of course, I think when we have this discussion, we often abdicate the private sector of its responsibility, where even though they are a key component and factor within the question of irregular and problematic procurement practices. And so I think this has to be taken into account in terms of our prognosis as to how to overcome it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dominic. Russell, Nelly's question, 5 seconds.
Look, 5 seconds. Firstly, I obviously want to thank everybody for taking the time to starting this conversation with us. You know, I don't think that policies on their own, like Dominic says, are silver bullets. But democracy is a verb, right? And I think we all need to start thinking of democracy as a joint activity of all South Africans, right? I think we need to become a little bit more intentional about the things that we need to do, right? And with that intentionality, link all of our governance processes to achieve the outcomes that we want. The NHI is a highly contested bill because it goes to the very heart of people's fears. We've just come out of a global pandemic. And in that pandemic, we saw firstly the value and importance of a strong publicly funded healthcare system. And we also saw the downside of having a fragmented parallel response to delivering healthcare services. And the cost was not only just in lives, but also in economy. Imagine how many less lockdowns we would have had if we had a strong public health system where people could go get a diagnosis within 24 hours, or like it was in the private sector, rather than 3 to 4 days in the public sector. What if we had a system where we trusted all the different health actors to work within the interests of the public at large and advancing health overall? But these ideals are not achievable on their own. These ideals are not achievable by abdicating them to government, right? For us to achieve our developmental goals requires ongoing conversations that deal with the substance of the issues and then hold political parties account for their response to dealing with the substantive issues. In our view, rural health in particular, because we have high levels of unemployment, we have a high concentration of young people and older people as life expectancies expand, and we are completely reliant on publicly funded services. When these get eroded, the people that suffer most are the people that have the least opportunity to change things, right? And while we'll feel safe with our private medical scheme coverage, you know, I don't think it's really in the national interest or demonstrates the kind of social solidarity that our constitution aspires for us to say, those without medical aid is somebody else's problem. We need one unified response to healthcare. A more direct response to Johanna's question, on its own, the current institutional arrangements, we don't know enough to know whether on their own they will mitigate corruption influences. That is an ongoing process. And I think us as a Rural Health Advocacy Project will continue to focus on our mission, which is to promote, protect, and advance access to healthcare for rural communities. And everything that impacts on that will be in our purview. And certainly the Office of Procurement, the Procurement Regulator, the NHI Fund are areas that we will continue to engage on. And we hope to continue to engage our community around it so this can be an ongoing conversation. There's no beginning and end. It's something that we're going to have to do for the next 30 years. But thank you very much for the opportunity to engage with us. And please check our website, reach out to us if there's anything that you would like to engage us around or contribute to. And let's really work together to creating the kind of South Africa we all dreamed about in 1994. Those of us that were born, right? And I still think it's realizable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will not hold you hostage anymore. Thank you so much for you honoring us with your time. And I'd like to just send our heartfelt gratitude to all our panelists who have done an extraordinary job making us understand the complexities of these issues. And the work continues on, and let's work together. And just for media, after this, we're going to be sending out a media statement about the report, sending out the report as well. Let's continue with the engagements. Yes, thank you so much for everybody who stayed 30 minutes longer. We really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for honoring the invitation. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a productive day forward. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, RHAP. Bye, everyone.